Hello, I'm Baroness Camilla de la Reynarde of the Middle Kingdom. I did this class last year for virtual Penzic, and I decided to incorporate Tudor Flat Caps again this time. So this year I'm going to talk about the art and artifacts first, then talk about the tools that you'll need to make these caps, and then my intrepid cameraman is going to shoot over my shoulder while I demonstrate the particular techniques that I discuss. Now, everyone's gotten a good look at the title card. This is my email address. I may attempt to upload my handout, but in case it doesn't work, email me. Now today we're going to start off with Tudor Flat Caps. What is a Tudor Flat Cap? What makes a Tudor Flat Cap a Tudor Flat Cap? Well, this example is from the Museum of London. It's a very good resource. It has a lot of caps and a lot of bits and pieces of caps. There's no one standard cap that is the definitive Tudor Flat Cap. But this one has a lot of the features. This is from the Museum of London. It is artifact number NN8512. The production date is 1500 to 1599, because sometimes these curators don't know how to date these things, because it's just so impossible to date them sometimes. This is described as a man's wool cap with a front brim and a neck flap, which has been knitted in the round in stocking stitch. Short lengths of plain weave silk ribbon have been inserted in pairs in the back and sides of the cap and extend down the neck. In the 16th century, after knitting caps were then fulled, which means they were washed, beaten, and felted, and napped, which means they use a very fine comb or a plant called a teasel to raise the nap and trim the pile to produce a stiff, hard-wearing fabric. Knitted caps were worn by men in London's business and working communities in Tudor times. They were designed to be warm and waterproof. There was a range of styles and qualities to suit everyone. There may have been as many as 15 to 20 stages involved in making one cap, and they are products of highly skilled professional workers. Bright colors such as blue or red were common, as were black and dark brown. Most caps are now what is referred to as archaeological brown. This is a new term I heard recently, and it's so descriptive. After 400 years in mud, you're going to see a lot of things are archaeological brown. Caps that were undyed are usually archaeological brown. So, in the 1571 statute that Parliament passed, every man over the age of 6, except those of high rank, were supposed to wear a knitted cap made in England on Sundays and holidays. Some caps were trimmed with ribbons to imitate more expensive versions in silk, and a lot of them were made in wool. Now this one, the brim appears to be split. That may or may not be due to 400 years of being in the mud. Who can say? And you can just see the ribbon here. Now caps have a lot of different little bits and pieces about them. Some of them have brims that have been slit, and some of them have brims that are one piece, and some of them have double brims. It just depends on which cap you're looking at. There is no one definitive cap, but they are generally referred to as Tudor Flat Caps. Why? Because of the way they were worn, or according to Hans Holbein. This is worn pretty flat on the head. Now this is not an absolute written in stone fashion statement, but if you look at the number of Holbein's portraits that show men wearing their caps like this, as opposed to this pulled down A lot more people are wearing them like this. So what does it look like when you recreate a Tudor flat cap? Well, it looks like this. This was done in, I forget what weight wool, and then it was felted. It has the brim that is double thick, which means this is the starting point. You start here, you knit and increase until the brim is as wide as you want it. Then you decrease back in and you knit the brim together. You can still just see it a bit here on the inside. And then you increase back out till it's about as wide as the brim is again. Then you decrease to the center point. Now some of these have a little stem that looks like a modern beret. Some of them don't. Some of them that were found on the Mary Rose have a scrap of silk fabric tacked inside for a little extra warmth. Now, as one of these people that is always cold, I can tell you that wool over silk is one of the warmest combinations in the world. Don't leave home without it. But it's doubtful that most modern men in North America will want to wear something this thick and heavy. And like I said, we're going to discuss a little bit more about techniques later. But the vast majority of these were made out of wool, or at least the vast majority that have survived. Remember, anything I tell you today could be contradicted by a grave find tomorrow. But basically, if you find a tam pattern or a beret pattern that you like, follow those directions. You may want to make it 10 to 20% bigger so it can felt and still fit you, and you will have a Tudor flat cap. Now, the next one we're going to discuss in art and artifact is the Mammoth Cap, and I've got these reversed. This is what everyone thinks of as a Mammoth Cap. This is from a website that I'm not sure still exists anymore. It has to do with Welsh heritage. So you can see that it's archaeological brown. It's got a thick brim. You can tell that it's turned up and knitted together. It's got an edging here and a loop. And it's got a little stem or a button up here of some sort. Who knows how, or what kind. But that's the tricky part. This is the only cap that shows all the features mentioned by Kirsty Buckland in her founding article about the Mammoth Cap. And she also wrote the section about caps and hats in the Mary Rose book. Again, like I said, if I'm not successful in uploading at least my bibliography to the class handout site, email me. So, Buckland states that you cast on about 59, 60 stitches, so that's easy for people to do. It's going to be about 20 stitches per needle. You knit a total of 16 rows, then you fold the brim up and knit it together and then shape it. So you want to knit about 6 inches total deep before you start decreasing, because the depth of the average head from, say, like middle of your ear to the top of the head still hasn't changed in all this time. Now, cappers as a guild existed as early as the 1340s. They existed for quite a long time. So Buckland tells us that cappers existed, Mammoth caps existed, and this is probably how they were made. The trick is, how did they do it? Because you can see this edging here, and the question becomes, how did they do that? Because some people, when they see a Mammoth cap, they have this urge to knit the cap, knit the brim as a separate piece, sew the two together. I have my doubts about that. Remember, you're trying to make this fast enough that you can sell it for a profit. And this cap existed for a very long time, so it was very, very popular. It's depicted in art. I'll show you some art here in a minute. It's mentioned in Shakespeare. It was on the list of things to pack for the New World as late as the 1620s when the Pilgrims were coming to Plymouth. So, Kirsty Buckland doesn't mention how the button is formed, so I had to come up with my own method. This is my reproduction of a Mammoth Cap. It's reddish. No one mentions the colors on this, but the gauge is huge. It's 2.5 stitches to the inch, and that may be after fulling or felting. However, you can see the stitch definition is clear enough in this example that this cannot have been fulled or felted very much, if at all. So I used a size 11 needle, which is 8 millimeters, and some very thick yarn, and I cast on 60 stitches, and I knit 16 rows, and I folded it over. So I did 8 rows for the brim, 8 rows for the outside, folded it over, and knitted it together, and I'll demonstrate that here in a minute. Then I knit it till it was about at least 6 inches deep. So that's about 6 inches, and that's about where the decreases start. Then I decreased it, and don't worry about being too symmetrical with the decreases. Recent academic study of knitted artifacts shows that they were not that picky about their decreasing or increasing and where they put them. So when you get down to about the final 5-7 stitches, I just knit that as a tube for about 1 inch or so. And some people just tie that off and tie it in a knot. But I like to gather the stitches, pull it tight, then come down through the button, out the base, weave the thread through there, pull that tight, and that squishes the button down. Now I have a reason for doing it this way. You know, it did get warm in medieval Europe every now and then, so I have to wonder if they would turn the brim up and button it up. Plus, the loop gives you the opportunity, or the wearer, to hang it anywhere you can. So we have this as the archaeological evidence. We have this as the artistic evidence. This is from the Holcomb Family Picture Bible. This is from the 1340s. And there's some merchants haggling over the price of the nails for the cross, for the crucifixion. So this one's in blue, and it has the button as red. The little stem of the beret as red. So that shows that this is worn by a tradesman of some sort. And then I was fortunate enough to go to the British Army Museum in London in 2012. This is a cap that was on one of their mannequins on display. This is gray, more than likely wool. It doesn't look like it's been fulled or felted too much. You can just about see the last little bit of yarn from the cast on. You can see they've done something here for the edge. Everyone assumes that's a seam from where you sew one piece into the other, but I have my doubts. And you've got that tiny little button there on top. So if this is good enough for a mannequin in the National Army Museum, it's good enough for me. And the odd thing about Buckland's article, she's very specific about this loop, about how it has 14 stitches. And it took me a while to decipher that. but I think I've figured it out. This is a slightly different view of the same cap. You can see it hasn't been fulled, it hasn't been felted. The brim is obviously double thick. You can just about see where it's knit together there. And you can, I couldn't get as good a shot of the button on top as I wanted to. That was annoying, but it just couldn't be done. So this is what the average schmo wore for a very long time. Some theories suggest it was worn as a helmet liner. In our current Middle Ages, most men are not going to wear this in the summertime because it's wool, and they won't want that inside their helmet. So that's the Mammoth Cap. And next we move on to Thrum Caps. Next we move on to Thrum Caps.
Break it up?
No. Now, Thrum Caps. They are a real rabbit hole because you have all these legends about Thrum Caps, and who knows how many, if any of them, are correct. The most superficial definition is a Thrum Cap is made a lot like a Mammoth Cap, really, and it has leftover warped pieces of yarn called thrums woven or knitted into it, giving it a fuzzy, if not shaggy, look. There is a poem titled The Ballad of the Caps that says that sailors wear Thrum Caps, and then there's a suburban legend from that says the ship's carpenter wore a red Thrum Cap. That one I don't know where it came from. However, no Thrum Caps were found on the Mary Rose, which sank in 1545, or the Svalbard whaling station, which was active 1612 to 1750-ish. This was a joint Dutch-Basque consortium that established a whaling station at an island just at the edge of the Arctic Circle in the North Sea. Now, it is the largest single cache of knitted caps, even if it is post-period, but none of them are Mammoth Caps, and none of them are Thrum Caps. There's a lot of other different styles, but none of them are Mammoth Caps or Thrum Caps, which is quite a surprise. Back to Thrum Caps. So we've got this legend that only men wore Thrum Caps, and especially ship's carpenters or sailors in general. However, there's a scene in The Merry Wives of Windsor that features cross-dressing, in which some ladies are trying to smuggle Falstaff out of the building in women's clothes, including Auntie's Thrum Cap. There's a 1560s will that mentions a woman's silk Thrum Cap. So that blows the gender-specific, job-specific, and fiber-specific idea of a Thrum Cap. But there are no surviving definitive Thrum Caps. Kirsty Buckland's cap section in the Mary Rose book mentions a Thrum Cap in the National Museum of Ireland, but did not include a picture. The museum does not have a searchable database and has not responded to email. So, there are a few pictures on Pinterest of what are supposed to be Thrum Caps. However, they do not include the museum collection number of the artifact in the photograph, and they don't include a good name of the museum. One of them was like the National Museum of Copenhagen or something, and there's no museum in Denmark by that specific name. So if you don't include the collection number and the exact name of the museum in your picture on Pinterest, it's not a lot of use, unfortunately. So, we've got conflicting artistic evidence. We've got no definitive archaeological evidence, everything contradicts each other, even some of the artistic evidence. This is by a gentleman by the name of Peter Artson. This is one of his two paintings of the scene of Christ and the woman taken in adultery. And it shows two different men wearing fuzzy caps. Now, I picked this one for a reason. And a lot of Dutch market scenes have a lot of workmen's clothes front and center. So if you want to see a wide selection of 16th century men's clothes for everyday classes, look for them. But this one is front and center of Christ and the woman taken in adultery. And you can see it does not fit the other cliche we have of Thrum Caps, which is they are tall and shaggy and worn by sailors. So this one is so tall and so shaggy, you have to wonder if it could be fur as much as a Thrum Cap. However, I decided to go with this one and see if I could recreate that for a very simple reason. This dude is obviously one of my husband's ancestors. Now, about the time I started getting interested in Thrum Caps, there were some knitting book authors who started talking about this new loop stitch. They presented it as a new loop stitch to add loopiness to whatever it was you were making, in case you were knitting bath mitts or whatever. And then that drove me to check my copy of Barbara Walker's stitch dictionaries or stitch collection books. So I found a loop stitch in there. So between finding this portrait and that loop stitch, I created that cap. Or actually, in fact, this cap. So this is the same yarn, believe it or not, as this cap. But this has gone through the washing machine a couple of times, and this has not. So I used the same basic structure as the Mammoth Cap. I cast on about as many stitches. Now, I cast on more because I was using just one strand of yarn instead of two, like I did for this one.
This is the same yarn.
Yeah, this is the same yarn. So I knit 8 rows plain, and then I started thrumming it, and when I'd reached a total of 16 rows, I knit it together, and then after that, the shaping was just like the Mammoth Cap. I knit it to the depth of the average head, and then started decreasing. Now, this is short thrums, I know. And some people say, oh, they've got to be real long and shaggy. Maybe they do. I don't know. I'm not sure anyone knows. But this is what worked. So, now that we have discussed the caps, now it's time for talking about the tools you will use. You're going to be using needles of several different sizes, and if you have issues finding needles, double-pointed needles, get yourself one of these and go to someplace with a lot of dowel rods.
This is an incredibly large file, dear. Do you want to break it up?
All right. Tools and what you need now. Okay. When you work on double-pointed needles, sometimes you can't find the length you want and the size you want. It drives me insane that knitting needle manufacturers make these stubby little needles in double pointed sets. So I take this to the craft store and I find dowel rods, just dowel rods. And I find the size dowel rod I need. And then I cut them up, run them through the pencil sharpener, maybe buff them with just a very light bit with some sandpaper, and then maybe just a very little bit of clear shoe polish or beeswax, just enough to catch any scuffies that might still be there. Now, what yarn are you going to be using? You're going to be using wool. 99% of the time, you're going to be using wool. That was what the average person wore, and 2 of these 3 caps were worn by predominantly the average person. So, how did they knit these things? That's the question. There's starting to be more academic research on knitting techniques and knitting terminology, and it has not filtered out widely yet, but it's on its way. So, at the moment, it seems to be easiest to do a knit cast on when you're turning up these brims, which I will show you here in a minute, after I show you how to do knit cast on first. Now, if you're this interested in knitting, I'm assuming that you know at least how to do a slip knot. So you twist it, put it through, and catch it. So that is a slip knot. Now to do a knit on cast on, which may or may not be period, some evidence suggests this or a cable cast on is period. If you have any issues with these techniques, check with your local fiber artist. So that's just the knit on cast on. You keep doing that until you've got the number of stitches you need. Now this makes a loose base, which you will need for the next technique. And the next technique is when I was talking about turning up these brims. This is a Mammoth Cap in progress. I cast on with 2 strands of that yarn loosely with a knit on cast on. I've done a total of 16 rows. And now I'm ready to turn this brim under and close it. And some people think, oh, I come back later and turn it under and sew it down. No, don't make more work for yourself. What you're going to do you put your needle through your next stitch. You put the needle through the cast on loop. You knit them together. Do it one at a time if you have to. And there it is. So again, you put the needle through the loop, the stitch, you put the needle through the cast on loop, and there, it's joined. This also solves the problem of making caps without ribbing, which we really don't see before the 1650s or so. And then you're knitting curling, And there are some artifacts that have 400 or 500 years of gravity on them, and they still curl. That's how pervasive that curl is. So one more time. You put the needle through the stitch. You put the needle through the cast-on loop. You knit through there, and that's how you do it. Now then, when you're finishing the Mammoth Cap, and you want to add that edging that you see on there, there's different schools of thought. Some people say, well, you could purl a row, and that would mark the line between the 8 rows that are going to be inside and the start of the cap. You could do that. Some people say, well, you could crochet it. You could, and I've done it, but it isn't period. There's no evidence for crochet in period at this time. Sorry to be that blunt, that's just how it is. So what I have done in the past is I'm using a chain stitch. And any of your embroidery pals will tell you how to do this. So at the folded edge, I just come under I've already got this started. I come under the previous stitch. I go through the edge stitch. I'm coming through a big loop I have. And of course it's trying to act up on me. And you could make these as big as you want. So it just repeats from there. You made a loop, you're going through it. And then the question becomes, how do you make the loop with 14 stitches like Buckland mentions? Well, after seeing pictures of the Duro-Europos fragment, which is in the Yale Art Collection, which is the earliest known piece of anything resembling knitting, but experts tell me it's now bending, they have this type of buttonhole on those fragments. So it makes me wonder if this is what they did. So I'm going to do a loop of thread. And so as I was saying before, some telemarketer interrupted us. May they burn in hell. I've made a loop here. And I'm going to reinforce that a bit. So now I am going to do a buttonhole stitch. There again, ask some of your embroidery pals. And when you do it this way, this mimics the results that they have in the National Army Museum. Now, it's been a while since I've done this, so I may not be doing it perfectly correctly. So you have a buttonhole stitch. Let's try it this way. See if it does better. Oh yeah. All right, scoot that up. I was trying to do it left-handed, I suppose. There we go. There, that's better. And that's what it's supposed to look like. And then when you reach the base, you just resume your chain stitch. And now comes the marvel that is thrumming. Now when I make a thrum cap, I use an American size 8 needle, which is 5 millimeters. And I haven't bothered to see how many stitches I've got cast on here. But you can see that most modern American men are not going to want to wear this because the texture inside is pretty nubbly, and you have to make it out of wool because it won't really felt properly if it isn't made out of wool. So I have cast on the number of stitches I need. I've done 8 rows plain, and then I started thrumming it every other stitch, every other row, so it's offset. And you see how shaggy it can look. In fact, when I tried this with this yarn, I made it very large, and this is how it turned out. So it turned out shaggy, not fuzzy. And it's just too big, at least for most people. My husband threatened to steal it for a car washing mitt. But that's neither here nor there. So, this row I have to do double duty. I have to knit the brim together. So I'll go through the cast on edge. And then through the current stitch. And then I have to do it again. So this time, when I come back, well, let's just do it this way. All right, thrum stitch. You go into the stitch, you knit, you've got the new stitch on the right needle, the old stitch on the left needle, you come between the stitches, catch it on your thumb, take it back around, and this is where you get to make it as shaggy as you want. If you want to pull it all the way out to here, you can. If you want it just fuzzy, make it shorter. Then you knit into the old stitch again, knit it again, and then past the first new stitch over the second new stitch. Let's see that again. I'm knitting the stitch. The new stitch is on the right needle. The old stitch is on the left needle. I bring the yarn between the needles, wrap it around my thumb, take it back through, knit into the old stitch again, and then pick up the first new stitch and put it over the second new stitch. There's a reason you have to do it this way. One more time. Knit, new stitch, old stitch, thrum stitch. Now, if I cheat and just get this, slip this over here, on the right needle and slip the stitch over this does not lock the thrum stitch in place. There it goes. It's gone. That's why you have to knit into the old stitch again. So, where am I? Here I am. All right, one more time. Knit, new stitch, old stitch, thrum stitch, knit into old stitch, because this is what locks it. First new stitch, second new stitch, first new stitch gets slipped over second new stitch. There. It's locked. It's not slipping out. So you can see you can use your thumb to vary the degree of shagginess you want in your cap. So that's all the tips and techniques I really need to convey today. Remember, when in doubt, if you can't find needles the length you want and the size you want, go find dowel rods. You're going to be making these in wool, because that's what the average dude wore. Thrum stitch, thrum caps may have been this shaggy. They may only have been fuzzy. We don't know. Mammoth caps have the largest gauge, 2.5 stitches of the inch. We don't know the gauge on Thrum caps or Tudor Flat Caps. So, have fun with it. I hope you have a successful cap. Thank you very much.